Imagine waking up one morning, just like any other day, only to discover that you've won a life-changing amount of money. $10 million, to be exact. It seems impossible, right? But for one woman, that dream became her reality. She had played the lottery on a whim, never really expecting to win, but as the numbers flashed on the screen, there it was, her ticket to a brand new life. She couldn't believe her eyes, her hands shaking as she double-checked the numbers. This wasn't just some small win, this was a dream that millions wish for, a jackpot that could erase every financial worry she'd ever had. The weight of the moment hit her, and she felt both excitement and disbelief wash over her. The future that once seemed out of reach now felt like it was in her hands. The house, the car, the vacations, all within her grasp. But what happened next would prove that even the biggest dreams can sometimes come with an unexpected twist. What should have been the happiest time of her life quickly spiraled into something darker, something she never saw coming. The excitement of winning such a large sum of money was overshadowed by something far more sinister, a level of hatred and racism that would rock her world. In a moment that would change everything, people she once trusted and respected began to show their true colors. As she stepped into her newfound wealth, the world around her seemed to shift in ways that felt out of her control. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers began to treat her differently. People who once celebrated her success now eyed her with suspicion, disdain, and envy. The very community that had once been her support system now felt like an alien place, a reminder of how quickly things could go from extraordinary to terrifying. She was no longer just a lucky winner. She was now a target. The harsh reality of racism seeped into every part of her life, from the whispers behind her back to the outright hostility that greeted her in some places she went. As her life began to unravel, she realized that this victory she had dreamed of could also be her downfall. The world wasn't just waiting to take her money, they were waiting to tear her down, simply because of who she was. But what made this situation even more chilling was that the more she tried to defend herself, the more she felt like she was losing. The fight she found herself in wasn't just about the money, it was about her identity, her dignity, and her place in a society that had just shown her its ugliest side. And the more she fought, the deeper she was dragged into this nightmare, a battle she never wanted to fight in the first place. What happens when winning the lottery isn't just about the money, but about surviving the hate that comes with it? How do you protect yourself when your life is suddenly turned upside down by people who want nothing more than to see you fail? And what happens when the people who are supposed to support you become the ones who hold you back? This is a story about more than just money. It's about resilience in the face of adversity, about fighting for your right to exist in a world that suddenly feels like it wants to swallow you whole. It's a reminder that no matter how much you think you've won, there are forces out there that are always looking to tear you down. So, as you listen to her story, ask yourself, what would you do if the very thing you thought was your blessing became the very thing that almost destroyed you? How far would you go to protect everything you've worked so hard for, and what price are you willing to pay to ensure that you don't become just another story of someone crushed by the weight of world's cruelty? But don't think it ends here. This is only the beginning. What she faced after winning that life-changing amount of money is about to take a turn no one could have predicted. You'll want to stay tuned because what happens next might just leave you speechless. When the first signs of trouble began to appear, she didn't recognize them for what they were. It started off small, a glance that lasted too long at the grocery store, an uncomfortable silence whenever she entered a room. At first, she brushed it off. After all, who wouldn't stare at someone who had just won a huge lottery? But as days turned into weeks, the stares became sharper, more judgmental. They weren't just curious looks anymore. They were filled with something darker. It didn't help that she had always kept to herself. She wasn't one to flaunt wealth, and this sudden windfall made her even more cautious. The house she bought with the money was modest compared to the lavish mansions people had expected her to purchase. But it was enough for her, a safe haven where she could live comfortably and finally feel secure. Or so she thought. The whispers followed her everywhere. She couldn't go to the park without hearing the hushed tones behind her back, as if people were trying to piece together the story of her fortune. Some would smile at her, but it was a smile that didn't reach their eyes. They were waiting for something. She wasn't sure what, but she felt a palpable sense of unease that she couldn't escape. It wasn't long before she began to notice the first hints of hostility. It was subtle at first, people cutting in front of her in line, pretending not to see her as she waved for attention, or avoiding eye contact altogether. But then the incidents grew more frequent. At a local restaurant, a waitress had taken her order only to ignore her for the rest of the meal, offering service to everyone else around her, even though her food was clearly ready. And when she tried to speak to the manager, she was met with cold indifference. Her heart began to race as she realized something was wrong. This wasn't just about her winning money. Something else was at play here, something far deeper. It wasn't until she overheard a conversation in the bank that the full weight of the situation hit her. It was a woman at the counter, speaking with a bank teller. She was loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "I hear she's one of them," the woman said, voice dripping with disdain. "I never liked her. It's funny, really, seeing a woman like that, winning so much money. It doesn't sit right with me." The words stung, but the worst part wasn't just hearing them, it was the knowing. She wasn't the only one feeling this way. Others were speaking behind her back. They had started to form an opinion about her, one that wasn't based on who she was, but on what they assumed her life must now be like. They saw her as a symbol of something they resented, something they didn't understand. It was clear now her wealth had become a burden she never imagined would come with so much hatred. But it didn't stop there. One afternoon, when she was driving home from a local shop, she noticed a car tailing her. At first, she thought nothing of it, but the car stayed right behind her, almost too close for miles. The tension in her chest grew with every turn she took. When she finally pulled into her driveway, the car sped away, but not before the driver gave her a long, piercing stare through the rearview mirror. It shook her. But more than the fear, it made her angry. She had worked hard for everything she had, and now, just because she had won the lottery, she was being treated like an outsider, like she didn't belong. Days passed, and the world seemed to close in on her. She couldn't walk through her neighborhood without feeling the weight of eyes on her back. Every trip to the grocery store felt like a trial, as people would gossip in hushed tones or turn away when she tried to make small talk. Her neighbors, once friendly faces, now barely acknowledged her when they saw her out on her morning walks. Even her family seemed to change. Her cousins, who once came to visit often, started making excuses. They stopped calling. The once warm relationship turned cold, distant. She couldn't understand it. She thought they would be happy for her. Instead, it felt as though they resented her good fortune. They never said it outright, but she could feel the judgment in their glances. "Maybe it's better if you just lay low for a while," one of her close friends advised one evening, after a particularly uncomfortable encounter in the neighborhood. "People are jealous. You have to be careful." But careful about what? She had always been cautious, always avoided drawing attention to herself. Yet now, with her life thrown into chaos, it felt as though the world was turning against her for no reason other than the money in her bank account. She felt like a prisoner in her own life. As time went on, the hostility only deepened. Her name was being whispered on the news in a way that made her cringe. The media had started reporting on her win, and every article seemed to paint her in a negative light. They mentioned her race, her background, as though those things somehow explained why she didn't deserve such a fortune. As if the amount of money she had won wasn't the issue, they made it about her. Her race. Her existence. The more she tried to ignore it, the more it ate away at her. What was happening? How could something that was supposed to be the greatest thing that had ever happened to her turn into the worst nightmare of her life? One evening, the situation reached a breaking point. She had been out to dinner with a few acquaintances from her old job. They were happy to see her, or at least, they pretended to be. But as the night wore on, it became clear that they were no longer interested in celebrating her success. The conversation turned from lighthearted to uncomfortable. "You must be really busy now, huh?" one of them asked, a forced smile on their face. "Must be hard to juggle it all. Winning all that money and everything." She nodded, feeling the tension build in the room. "It's definitely been a big change," she replied, trying to keep the conversation casual. "Yeah," another person chimed in. "Must be nice to just not have to worry about anything, you know?" "It's not like that for everyone, though." She didn't understand where this was going, but the tone had shifted, and she felt a lump form in her throat. "That's true," she said, her voice shaking. "But everyone deserves a little bit of luck." One of them laughed a sharp, mocking sound. "Lucky, huh?" "Yeah, I'm sure it's just pure luck." She knew she was being baited, but she couldn't help herself. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice cold. But before anyone could respond, the waiter came to clear their plates. And just like that, the conversation shifted, the tension hanging in the air, unspoken but undeniable. She didn't know how much longer she could take this. She had won the lottery, but somehow, it felt like she was losing everything else. The respect of her friends, her neighbors, her own sense of belonging, it was all slipping through her fingers, and she was powerless to stop it. And then, one day, the first real threat came. She was walking back to her car after picking up groceries when she saw a group of people standing at the edge of the parking lot. Their eyes followed her every move, and before she knew it, one of them spoke up. "You think you're better than everyone now, don't you?" Her heart stopped. She didn't know what to say. The words stung, and they stung even more because she knew they weren't just about the money. It wasn't just about envy, it was about something far deeper. Something darker. As she turned to walk away, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. And that, somehow, it was only going to get worse. The truth was, the real battle had just begun. As the days passed, the weight of the situation grew heavier. The tension that had been building up now seemed to permeate every aspect of her life. No matter where she went, the sense of hostility followed her like a shadow she couldn't escape. The once familiar streets, where she'd lived her whole life, now felt foreign. Every corner turn seemed to lead her to another cold stare, a mocking comment, or worse, silence. It was as if she had become invisible, a figure everyone watched but no one truly saw. Her neighbors, once friendly faces, now avoided eye contact. A simple hello in the hallway of her apartment complex was met with an awkward pause, followed by hasty footsteps away from her. She started to notice how people's behavior had shifted. Before, she had been just another face in the crowd, blending in with everyone else. Now, she felt like an outsider in her own community. It wasn't just the glaring stares or the hushed whispers that rattled her, it was the sudden, subtle shift in how people treated her. It was as though her very existence had become a problem for them. And then there were the incidents that felt more like blatant acts of exclusion. She went to a local CAF one morning, trying to get some peace and enjoy a warm cup of coffee. The barista, who had always greeted her with a smile, barely glanced at her as she approached the counter. He took her order without speaking, his eyes darting nervously toward the line behind her. When she sat down, she watched as the CAF became increasingly crowded, yet no one offered her a seat. People who once exchanged pleasantries now acted like she was invisible. It wasn't until later that night, as she sat alone in her living room, staring at the untouched lottery check on the coffee table, that it hit her: this wasn't just some passing phase. This wasn't going to blow over. The resentment that had been quietly building around her had now taken root, and the ugliness was growing. Her phone buzzed, dragging her out of her thoughts. It was a message from an old friend. Her fingers hesitated over the screen. She had always prided herself on staying connected with those she cared about, but now she found herself reluctant to respond. The messages, no matter how well-intentioned, felt like they were laced with judgment. What was she supposed to say? Thank you for reaching out? How could she even explain what she was going through? Her phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from someone else she knew, someone she thought was her friend. Hey, I saw the news. You really did it, huh? $10 million. Just. Wow. The message hung in the air, almost too casual, but it stung in its own way. It was a simple message, yet the words felt like a trap. The comment wasn't congratulatory. It was like they were setting the stage to make her feel guilty for something she hadn't even asked for. She dropped her phone on the couch and sighed, rubbing her temples. The pressure was too much. Her phone kept ringing with messages and calls, but each one felt like an intrusion into a life she hadn't asked for. Everyone wanted something. She wasn't sure what they wanted. But it was clear they expected her to be different now that she had money. They wanted her to be grateful, to fit into their mold of what a lottery winner should look like: humble, generous, and at the same time, somewhat apologetic for their good fortune. But that wasn't how it worked, was it? The next morning, she went for a walk to clear her mind. The neighborhood looked the same, yet everything felt so different. She saw the familiar faces again, those of the neighbors who had stopped acknowledging her, and they were all there, gathered in small groups, talking in hushed voices, clearly avoiding her. It was then that she noticed something more troubling. There were whispers about her wherever she went. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what was being said, but it was clear she had become the subject of gossip. Her mind raced with possibilities. Were they talking about her win? Were they judging her for spending the money? Was this why the distance between her and everyone else had grown? She couldn't fathom it. But the worst part was that they weren't just gossiping, they were actively making her feel like an outcast in her own home. Then, things began to escalate in ways she never expected. One evening, as she came home from work, she found her mailbox destroyed. It was nothing too extreme, just a mailbox knocked over and some letters scattered on the ground, but it was enough to unsettle her. The mailbox was placed near the street, not far from her front door. It wasn't hard to imagine someone doing it on purpose. There had been a time when she would have shrugged off an incident like this, but now, with everything happening around her, she couldn't ignore the sense of malice in the air. As she walked toward the front door, she noticed another strange thing. A small envelope had been slipped under the door. Her heart sank as she picked it up, recognizing the handwriting as belonging to someone from her neighborhood. It wasn't an anonymous note, but the message inside was chilling all the same. Don't think you're safe. We know who you really are. The words didn't make sense. What did they mean? Who was we? The fear that had been growing in her chest suddenly bloomed into something far more visceral. She had no idea what to make of it, but one thing was clear: the tension was no longer just about her winning the lottery. This was about something far more insidious. This was personal. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or some group of people, were watching her. Everywhere she went, there was this sense of being followed, as though someone was always just around the corner, waiting for her to slip up. Her trust in the world around her had been shattered, and now, more than ever, she couldn't help but feel isolated, even in a crowd. As her once quiet life continued to unravel, the question began to gnaw at her: who could she trust? Could she even trust herself? Was this all in her head, or was there truly a conspiracy brewing in the shadows, waiting for her to break under the weight of it all? The strain began to show in her everyday life. She had always been a strong person, resilient, determined, but now, With every new challenge, she felt herself starting to unravel. It wasn't just the threats, the cold shoulders, or the whispers, it was the toll it was taking on her mentally. The stress was starting to eat away at her. She couldn't even enjoy a peaceful moment anymore without wondering if someone was about to ruin it, whether it was through an anonymous message, a strange encounter, or something even worse. Her thoughts were becoming clouded, and she began questioning everything. Her decisions. Her choices. Was winning the lottery a blessing or a curse? She wasn't sure anymore. But no matter how bad things got, one thing remained clear: she couldn't back down. She wasn't going to let these people win. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted from her, she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of watching her crumble. And so, she kept moving forward, determined to face whatever came next. But deep down, she knew the worst was yet to come, and when it arrived, it would hit harder than anything she had ever faced before. The days blurred together, each one more suffocating than the last. Every time she left her house, the weight of eyes on her back was undeniable. It wasn't just the looks anymore, it was the palpable sense of danger that lingered in the air. The message under the door had left an indelible mark on her. She couldn't shake the words, "We know who you really are." What did they mean by that? Who exactly was watching her, and why? These questions consumed her every waking hour, making her more paranoid, more withdrawn. She tried to push through it, telling herself that she was overreacting, but each strange encounter seemed to confirm her worst fears. There were more whispers in the grocery store, more cold stares from people she had once known. It felt as though everyone was in on something she wasn't. Like she had somehow become the enemy in her own life. Then came the phone calls. At first, they were just unknown numbers, 1 or 2 missed calls a day. She thought they were telemarketers, but something told her she should answer one. When she did, all she heard was heavy breathing, then a faint chuckle before the line went dead. Her heart raced. Whoever was behind this knew how to make her feel vulnerable, how to make her question her own sanity. One evening, as she arrived home, she found her car's tires slashed. Her knees buckled as she sank to the pavement, staring at the damage. She had to force herself to breathe, to stay calm. This was no accident. The malice was unmistakable. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but there was no one to turn to. She couldn't even call the police. What would she tell them? That someone was out to get her for winning the lottery? Who would believe her? That night, she locked every window, double-checked the doors, and sat in her living room with the lights off, feeling the dark close in around her. The walls felt like they were pressing in, the silence deafening. She was alone. So alone. Her phone buzzed again, the screen flashing with another unknown number. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned it off, praying for some peace. But even in the silence, her thoughts raged. She had become a prisoner in her own home. She couldn't even go for a walk in the park without feeling the stares, the suffocating presence of people who didn't understand her, didn't want to. She wanted to get away. She wanted to leave it all behind, to escape, but where could she go? Every place she'd once felt safe now felt like a trap. It was then that the messages started to escalate. More notes slipped under her door. The words were becoming more pointed, more threatening. The last one she found read, "We're coming for you. You can't hide." The chill that ran through her spine was like ice, but it was the final line that made her stomach churn. "You'll regret ever thinking you could keep that money." Fear gnawed at her insides, but anger was there too, growing with every passing moment. She had to do something. She had to stand up for herself. The idea of living in fear, of letting these faceless people control her life, was unbearable. But the deeper she looked into it, the more she realized that there were no easy answers. The people tormenting her weren't just random strangers, they were people who knew her, or at least thought they did. They were people from her past, people who had built their opinions of her based on a story they created, a narrative that didn't belong to her. Her mind spun as she tried to connect the dots. Who would want to hurt her this way? She'd been careful, hadn't flaunted her money, hadn't let it change who she was. But it didn't matter. The moment she won, she became a target. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about control. And someone wanted that control back. Her thoughts shifted to her family, her friends, those who had either distanced themselves or kept silent. Did they know something she didn't? Had they been part of this? Or had they been too afraid to stand up for her, to show her the support she needed? Her mind raced with all the possibilities, the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Every knock on the door sent her heart into overdrive. Every shadow seemed to grow longer, the nights colder. And every new message made her question if she would ever be safe again. One morning, she stepped outside to check the mail, a slight feeling of dread settling in her stomach. As she walked toward the box, she noticed something out of place. The envelope was thick, heavier than usual. She reached for it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she turned it over in her hands. There was no return address, just a single word scrawled on the front: run. Her breath caught in her throat. She tore it open, almost afraid of what she might find. Inside was a picture of her, walking into her own house, taken from the street. There was no mistaking it. Whoever had taken the picture had been watching her for days, maybe even longer. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They were getting closer. They knew where she lived. They knew everything. Her eyes darted around her, instinctively searching for any sign of someone lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. The street was quiet, just as it always was. It felt like the calm before a storm. She bolted back inside, locking the door behind her, her hands shaking as she leaned against it. She had to figure out what to do, how to fight back. She couldn't just sit here waiting for something worse to happen. But the longer she thought about it, the more she realized that there was no easy solution. No simple way to stop this madness. Her money had made her a target, but now, her life itself was on the line. The reality hit her hard. She was trapped. Her own success had turned her into prey. And with every passing minute, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The stakes had never been higher, and she had no idea who she could trust anymore. There was a knock at the door. Her heart stopped. This was it. She had to face whatever was coming. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. The door was about to open. And everything was about to change. The knock at the door echoed through the silent house, louder than any sound she'd heard in days. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat amplifying the fear, the anxiety that had gripped her. She wasn't ready for whatever was on the other side. Was it one of them? The people who'd been tormenting her, pulling the strings from the shadows? Or was it something worse, something she couldn't even imagine? She hesitated, every instinct telling her to hide, to run, but there was no escape. There was no more running. The door was her only choice. With trembling hands, she reached for the handle. She felt a sense of inevitability wash over her, a chilling realization that whatever happened next would change everything. Slowly, she opened it, the air thick with tension. But standing on her doorstep wasn't what she expected. It wasn't a stranger, or some shadowy figure from her past. It was a familiar face, someone she thought she could trust. Someone who had been a part of her life for years, someone who had seemed to have disappeared from her world entirely. It was a face she hadn't seen in months, yet it felt like a lifetime ago. Her breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, eyes wide with disbelief. She had to be seeing things, or maybe the stress of everything was finally breaking her. But no, it was real. It was him. He looked different, worn down, as if time had taken its toll on him in a way that she hadn't expected. His eyes were hollow, the familiar warmth replaced by a cold, calculating look. He wasn't the person she had known. There was something off about him, something she couldn't place, and the uncertainty in her gut flared up again. "I had to come," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "You're in danger." The words hit her like a jolt of electricity. Danger. She had been living in fear for days, but hearing those words from someone she knew, someone she trusted, only made everything feel even more real. Her pulse raced as she stepped back, allowing him into her home, though every part of her screamed to run. He wasted no time, stepping inside and glancing around with a sharp, almost frantic look. "They're closing in on you," he continued, his voice shaking. "I never wanted you to find out like this, but it's too late now. They've been watching you." She didn't know what to say. Her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what he was telling her. They? Who were they? Hadn't she already been through enough? "What do you mean?" "Who's been watching me?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. His eyes flicked to the door, as though checking to see if anyone else was nearby. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want you to get involved in all this. But now..." He trailed off, clearly struggling with the words. "You're a pawn in a much bigger game than you realize." The room seemed to shrink around her, the air thick with tension. She felt like she was suffocating, but she couldn't look away. "What game? What are you talking about?" His gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, it almost seemed like he was about to reveal everything. But instead, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "The lottery wasn't just a chance for you to win. It was a setup. You were targeted from the beginning." The words shattered her, reverberating through her thoughts like an explosion. A setup? Targeted? This couldn't be happening. No. That's not true. I won fair and square. There's no way. "You don't understand," he interrupted, his tone urgent. "They'd been watching you for years. And they knew the moment you won, they'd have you in their sights." She felt the floor drop from under her mind racing to process what he was saying. Who could have orchestrated this? Who would want to turn her life into a nightmare? She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but his next words stopped her cold. "They're not just after your money. They're after you. The money was a way to lure you in, to make sure you were in the right place at the right time. You're part of something bigger now, and you can't get out." Her head spun. Everything she thought she knew was crumbling, piece by piece. The lottery, the strangers, the threats, it was all connected, but she still couldn't see the full picture. The walls were closing in, and now, someone she had trusted was telling her that there was no escape. "What do you mean, part of something bigger?" she asked, barely able to get the words out, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked around again, his expression tense. "There's an organization, a network of people who've been operating in the shadows for years. They've infiltrated everything: the police, the government, businesses. They control everything. And they've been setting their sights on you for a long time. The lottery was just the beginning." Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath quickening as his words sank in. This was no longer just a story about a woman who won the lottery. It was something far more sinister, a web of deceit and corruption stretching far beyond what she could have ever imagined. And now she was trapped in the middle of it. But before she could process what he said, she heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the direction of the back door. Her instincts kicked in, and without thinking, she grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the front door. "They're here," she whispered frantically. "They're not going to stop." He nodded, his face grim, but there was no fear in his eyes. He knew exactly what was happening. We need to move. Now. She didn't have time to argue. The sound grew louder, closer, and she knew it was only a matter of moments before they'd be surrounded. Her mind raced as she grabbed her coat and keys. But as she turned to leave, she froze. On the table, right in front of her, was the lottery ticket, the same ticket that had started all of this, the one that had set everything in motion. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she realized the truth. The danger wasn't just from the people who had been threatening her. The danger was much, much closer than she could have ever anticipated. As she opened the door to flee, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. They were here. And they weren't just after the money anymore. They were after her. And there was nowhere left to run. The air was thick with the weight of her fear as she stepped into the night. She could hear them now, getting closer, footsteps echoing in the distance, steadily drawing nearer. Her heart raced, but she pushed herself forward, clutching her coat tight, her mind spinning. She glanced back at him, the man she once thought she could trust, but now he was just another part of the mystery. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the urgency in her tone impossible to ignore. He looked at her with a grim expression, his face hollow. "We need to get to the car. They're not far behind." The words barely registered before she turned and sprinted down the driveway, her breath sharp in the cold air. The car seemed miles away. Every part of her wanted to break down, to scream, but she couldn't afford the luxury of fear right now. The shadows behind her were closing in, and she could almost feel the eyes on her back, the breath of danger just inches from her skin. As they reached the car, she fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as she tried to unlock the door. The sound of footsteps grew louder, faster. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she heard a voice call out, "Stop!" It wasn't just one voice, it was several, all at once, sending chills down her spine. She yanked open the car door, barely squeezing inside before she slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and for a moment, there was hope that they could escape, that the nightmare was finally over. But as she drove, she felt the pull of something deeper, something that was still not quite right. The man beside her, the one who had come to warn her, was strangely silent. She stole a glance at him, her eyes searching his face, and then her breath caught. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't even looking ahead. His eyes were fixed on something far darker. There was an intensity there now, a look of someone who had finally made a decision, one that had been brewing for a long time. A decision she hadn't seen coming. She knew something was wrong. Before she could ask, he turned toward her, his expression cold and unreadable. "You were never supposed to get away. This was always the plan." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. "What do you mean?" "I trusted you." His lips curled into a tight smile. "I know. That was part of it. You needed to trust me. You needed to believe that I was your ally." He let out a sigh, his shoulders slumping. But it was all a lie. The world around her seemed to tilt. She slammed her foot on the brake, the car screeching as it came to a halt on the side of the road. Panic surged through her. She was too shocked, too disoriented to move. "You've been lying to me? This whole time?" His smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile, it was cold, calculating. "I had no choice. They had plans for you, but I made my own. You see, they wanted the money. They wanted your life. But I wanted something else." Something twisted in her chest, a deep, aching disbelief. "What could you possibly want? You knew what they were doing to me, what they've done to me." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "The truth is, I needed you to survive. They weren't just after your money, They were after the connection. You're part of something much bigger than you realize, and all this time, you've been an unwitting participant in a game you didn't even know you were playing. She felt the blood drain from her face as his words sunk in. What are you talking about? Her voice broke, the weight of everything pressing down on her. There's more to the lottery, more than you ever knew. It wasn't a random draw. They'd been rigging it for years, setting people up. People like you, people they could use. They needed someone who would trust them, someone who would break. His gaze turned dark. And you did. She didn't know whether to scream, to cry, or to run. The walls around her were crumbling, and her mind was struggling to piece everything together. Her mind raced to comprehend the depths of his betrayal. But just as the reality of his words hit her, the sound of a car revving in the distance caught her attention. Before she could react, headlights blinded them as a black SUV appeared behind them, closing the distance with alarming speed. Panic surged through her body. "Who's that?" she gasped. "Friends of mine," he said, his voice flat. "They're here to take you back. But don't worry, it's all part of the plan." The SUV drew closer, its engine growling as it pulled up alongside them. The passenger window rolled down, and a familiar face stared back at her. It was someone from her past, someone she had known before, someone who had seemed harmless, ordinary even. But now, as he looked at her, his face twisted with something darker, something more dangerous. "You really thought you could escape?" he sneered. "It was never going to happen." Her breath caught in her throat as the SUV's door swung open. The man next to her turned to her, his expression unchanging. "It's time." Suddenly, the car jolted. The air filled with the sharp sound of gunfire, followed by the crashing thud of metal on metal. She screamed, slamming the pedal to the floor as the world spun into chaos. The SUV was right behind them, but now, something wasn't quite right. The bullets hadn't come from them. The man beside her stared ahead unfazed. "It's over," he said flatly. "They've been tracking us for weeks. There's nowhere left to run." Just then, the car skidded to a halt, but it wasn't from the crash or the gunfire. It was because a figure stepped into the middle of the road, blocking their path. She slammed the brakes, barely missing the figure in front of her. The headlights illuminated a tall, imposing figure in a dark coat, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. And then, to her utter shock, the person removed their hat, revealing the same man who had just betrayed her. Her heart raced as the true twist of the story hit her. There were two of them. "You didn't think you were the only one, did you?" The second man smirked. In that moment, everything fell into place. The betrayal, the manipulation, it had all been carefully orchestrated, and she was the final piece in a much larger puzzle. She had been set up from the beginning. But just as she thought she might lose her mind entirely, a gunshot rang out. The world went black. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in her ears as everything went black. Time seemed to slow, her body frozen in a moment of pure, unrelenting fear. For a second, she thought it might all be over, her life reduced to a tangled mess of lies and betrayal, with no way to escape the chaos she'd been thrust into. But when she awoke, everything was different. She didn't know how much time had passed, but the world around her was eerily still. Her head throbbed, and her body felt stiff, as though it had been dragged through a storm. But her eyes slowly fluttered open, and she realized she wasn't alone. The darkness had given way to the dim, flickering light of a small room. She was lying on a cold, metal surface, and she could hear faint whispers in the distance, the sound of someone moving nearby. Panic surged through her chest, but it was quickly replaced with confusion. "Where am I?" She tried to sit up but immediately felt a sharp pain in her side. She gasped, her hand instinctively reaching for the wound, but to her surprise, there was no blood, no sign of injury. Then she heard a voice, soft but unmistakable. Are you awake? She froze, her heart racing. She knew that voice. She had heard it before many times, in fact. It was the voice of the man who had once been her ally, the man who had betrayed her. The man who had led her to this point. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and no words came out. Instead, she just stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He was sitting across from her, looking far more worn down than she had ever seen him. His face was gaunt, his eyes tired, but there was a hint of something in his gaze, something softer than before. I thought you were dead, she managed to rasp, her voice barely a whisper. I should have been, he said quietly, his tone heavy with regret. But I couldn't let it end like that. Her confusion deepened. What are you talking about? Why did you do all of this? Why did you betray me? He sighed, rubbing his face in frustration. It wasn't supposed to go like this. None of it. But there were things I couldn't control. Things I didn't even know existed until it was too late. She stared at him, waiting for an explanation. He continued, his voice more earnest now. The organization, the one that was after you. I was part of it. At first, I didn't know how deep it ran. I didn't understand what they were capable of. They wanted you because of your connection to the lottery, but they needed me to get close to you. They used me. She shook her head, trying to process the words. Used you? But you used me. You lied to me. I did, he admitted, his voice breaking. I played my part. I got too close. But there's something you don't know. Something I didn't even know until I started to dig deeper. The lottery wasn't just a game. It was a tool, a weapon in a much bigger scheme. The weight of his words hung in the air like a heavy fog. She felt as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted once again, and she was left trying to make sense of it all. What scheme? What are you talking about? The organization is bigger than you think. It's been manipulating events for decades. The lottery was just the beginning. They have their hands in everything: corporations, politics, even the police. They've been shaping the world from behind the scenes. And you? You were just a pawn in their game. Her mind reeled as he spoke, but something in his eyes told her he wasn't lying. She had seen the same fear in his face when he first came to warn her. He wasn't the same man she had known, and neither was the world she had thought she understood. I tried to protect you, he continued, his voice growing softer. I couldn't stop what was happening, but I wanted to warn you. I wanted to help you get out before it was too late. She didn't know what to say. The emotions inside her were a whirlwind: betrayal, anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite put her finger on. But it was hard to ignore the reality of the situation. She had been dragged into something far bigger than she could have ever imagined. And now, she was left with the consequences of her actions. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was oppressive, the weight of the past few days hanging heavily between them. But then, the man broke the silence again, his voice barely above a whisper. Listen, I can't fix everything. But there's one thing you need to understand. The organization isn't just after the money. They wanted to control you, to use you as a means to an end. But I've seen too much now. I know what they're capable of. And I can't let them win. The fire in his eyes was unmistakable now, an unyielding determination that hadn't been there before. She could see it, even through the pain and confusion. He was no longer the man who had manipulated her, no longer the one who had betrayed her for his own gain. He had become something else entirely. And in that moment, she realized something that shook her to her core: they were in this together. Whether they liked it or not, they were bound by the same force now, the same shadowy organization that had pulled the strings behind everything. It had taken her life, twisted it beyond recognition, and now, it was time for her to take it back. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos still swirling inside her. He looked at her with a mixture of regret and hope. "We fight back. We expose them. It's the only way." She felt a spark of something inside her, something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. The idea of fighting back seemed impossible, but the alternative was worse. If they didn't act now, they would never be free of this nightmare. Together, they made their plan. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick, but it was their only option. They would have to take down the organization piece by piece, using the resources they had, using the knowledge they had gained. And as they worked, they started to understand just how deep the organization's reach was. But as they gathered evidence, made alliances, and slowly chipped away at the walls of secrecy that had held the world captive for so long, they realized that the fight was bigger than they had ever imagined. It was no longer just about money, no longer about revenge, it was about something far more important. It was about truth and freedom, and the power of standing up to the forces that sought to control everything. In the end, they did it. Together, they exposed the organization for what it was: a web of corruption, greed, and manipulation. And as the world began to wake up to the truth, the pieces of her life slowly fell back into place. The lottery wasn't just a stroke of luck, it had been the key to something much larger, a way to uncover the hidden truths that had been buried for so long. But even as they celebrated their victory, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The world had changed. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to face whatever came next. She had learned one undeniable truth through all of this: the power to change her life, to reclaim her future, was never in the hands of the people who had controlled her. It had always been within her, waiting to be unleashed. And now, with the weight of the past behind her, she was free to shape her own destiny. And as she looked ahead to the future, she knew that no matter what came next, she would be ready. Because she had fought for this moment, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The end of one chapter, and the beginning of something new.